So welcome to the final week, week 6 of our study. I am excited. I got some good questions. I got a few softballs that aren't too bad and a few pretty tough questions. So we're going to have some fun going through them. And I'm really glad we did what we did and had people write the questions and give them to me to research, because even the easier questions were probably not questions I could have answered well off the cuff. So it was good to have a little time to look into them. So let's open in prayer and jump into some of these questions. Father, thank you so much for letting us come here again to study your word. God, I ask you to give us wisdom to understand your word, give us compassion to apply it to our own lives and other people's lives. And God, we just ask you for understanding as we study this. In Jesus' name, amen. So, let's see here. All right. So I got questions from several different people. You'll probably recognize the ones that are yours, but I'm not going to call out who asked what in case anybody cares. So we're going to jump in here. I just put them in order as I read them off cards, so they're in no order of priority or anything else. I didn't have time to do that. It took too much time to research them. So, in Joel chapter 2, it refers to the army of locusts. They march in line. So does this seem to be an engineered drone type of locust, or some AI-driven bug mechanically engineered by humans? Will the church be raptured at this time? So that's our first question. So if you go to Joel chapter 2, verse 2 is the primary verse we're talking about. And it says, "A large and mighty army comes, such as never was in ancient times, nor ever will be in ages to come." Now, if you read the rest of the chapter, there's a lot of description about how this army marches in line and doesn't break ranks and goes through defenses and is not harmed by them. So it's an interesting verse. It's clearly referring to one event in which the largest army ever attacks Israel. So to me, that weeds out things like when the Roman army, parts of it you could read through and maybe see the Roman army attacking Israel in like AD 70, but that would have been before John in Revelation, but obviously after Joel, because Joel was way back. And there's been other, the Babylonians conquered Israel and so on, but we know in Revelation that there's a very large army that's going to attack Israel. And this one is very clear that it is the largest army, such as never was in ancient times, nor will ever be again. The word "like" appears many times throughout Joel, several chapters, chapter 2, 3, 4. And it again seems kind of like John in Revelation, where he's having trouble describing it. He can't even figure out how to describe some of this stuff, so he says it's like this, it's like that, but it's clearly not what it is, but he doesn't know how to describe it. So if you're looking at chapter 2 in Joel, it says, or as I put, I believe verses 1 through 11 are describing the army of demonic locusts that we see in Revelation chapter 9 during the 5th trumpet. But verses 12 through 32 seem to be describing the attack from the north that happens in Revelation chapter 6 during the 2nd seal. But then when we go to chapter 3, it seems to be describing the Battle of Armageddon. So I spent quite a while reading these chapters over and over and over, and I'm not really sure if Joel is talking about 3 different events and going between them, or if this is one event that I can't wrap my head around. So I don't have a really good answer there, except I do believe that it's one of the 3 events in Revelation. So I don't see anything here that leads me to think it's AI. I think this is either a well-trained army or it's demonic, is my best guess on that. So yes, all of these events are during the tribulation, so the church is already gone. That was the second part of the question, will the church be raptured at this time? So I don't know which event in Revelation it is, but if it's any one of them, then we're already gone. If you haven't ever read the book of Joel, now that you've went through this Revelation study, read the book of Joel. If you thought Revelation was fun to figure out, Joel's a lot of fun. It's a lot crazier than Revelation, so it'll be fun. But you'll start to see then when if you read through Joel and you haven't studied Revelation, you're like, well, this is a lot of, like, we're all over the place here, crazy. Once you've read Revelation, you read through Joel, you'll start realizing, I know what that's talking about. That's talking about this, and that's talking about this. So they tie together in a lot of places, but in some places it's not entirely clear what it ties to. So that's my partial answer to that question. And we're going to have another AI one coming up with the next question, so we'll talk some more about that. The beast comes out of the earth, and the Antichrist gives him the ability to speak. Maybe he could be AI or mechanical robot. So this is a good question, because when you get online and start reading through Revelation, one of the theories that you'll see a lot of people propose is that the Antichrist is AI, the beast is AI, the beast is animatronic. I mean, this goes clean back to when Disney introduced animatronics. You know, people said, maybe that's what the beast will be. So there's lots of theories out there that all this stuff will be that way. So we're going to talk about a couple of aspects of that. In Revelation chapter 17, verse 8, says, the beast which you saw once was, now is not, and yet will come up out of the abyss and go to its destruction. So God was telling John in AD 90, almost 2,000 years ago, the beast that you saw, he existed in the past. He's going to come up out of the abyss. We're going to talk about that in another question in a few minutes. And he's going to go to its destruction. So we know the beast comes out of the abyss and goes to its destruction. In Revelation 19, verse 20, it says, but the beast was captured, and with it the false prophet who had performed the signs on its behalf. With these signs he had deluded them and received the mark of the beast and worshipped its image. The two of them were thrown alive into the fiery lake of burning sulfur. Now, if you remember my whole theory on the beast being, if you missed that night, please watch that recording. But my theory on the beast is that that Satan is resurrecting someone who has been dead from the past, and we talked about who that might be. This also fits with that theory because we know that the beast and the false prophet is a person. That's made clear in here. I don't think God would throw an AI computer into the lake of fire and call him he. So I think that rules that out. And it's interesting that the beast and the false prophet are thrown into hell alive, but yet we know the Bible tells us it's appointed to everyone to die. They didn't need to die, they've already died. So that's why they were thrown in alive, and I think it's interesting that was pointed out. So I think it's very, even if you don't subscribe to my idea that it's a resurrected man, I think that it's pretty clear reading those verses that it is either a man or demonic. This is being referred to as he and them and thrown into the lake of fire, so I have a hard time seeing that. Now, Revelation 13:5, this starts getting into where the question comes from. Revelation 13:5 says, the beast was given a mouth to utter proud words and blasphemies and to exercise its authority for 2 months. So when I researched this verse, it's not a literal mouth that we're talking about here. This is not that the beast was given a physical mouth so that he could talk. It's referring to given authority. And whose authority would you need to blaspheme God? You'd need God's. What this is saying, Revelation 13:5, God is saying, I gave the beast the authority to blaspheme me for 42 months and no more. After that, I'm going to put an end to it. But I'm going to let him do it for 42 months. Because normally, if you start blaspheming God, he's probably going to put an end to that pretty quickly. So this section of giving a mouth to utter proud words is talking about the authority God gives him to say, I'm going to let you do this for a short time, because it tells us for 42 months. Now we'll get to the part that I think really generated the question here. In Revelation 13 as well, it says, because of the signs it was given power to perform on behalf of the first beast, it deceived the inhabitants of the earth. It ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast who was wounded by the sword and yet lived. The second beast, which is also called the false prophet, was given power to give breath to the image of the first beast, so that the image could speak and cause all who refuse to worship the image to be killed. So the second beast doesn't give the first prophet the ability to talk. The second beast, it says here, ordered them to set up an image in honor of the beast. And while we don't know for sure, the image that's used here would seem to imply a statue of some sort. So what we think is that there's a statue set up to honor the first beast, and that the second beast uses demonic powers that he's been granted from Satan to give it the power to speak. And that's interesting because, again, we talk about all through Revelation, it's all, the term Antichrist comes up a lot. And it doesn't always just mean the opposite of Christ. The Antichrist is trying to imitate Christ. And in the Old Testament, I didn't put the verse in here, but there's an Old Testament verse where God mocks people that are, the Israelites that are worshiping idols, because he says you worship idols that have mouths but can't speak. And I think what we see here is that Satan sets up an idol, an image, an idol of the beast, and then gives it the ability to talk. So this is the image being given the ability to talk, not the beast. And going back to the question, part of that was about the beast comes out of the earth and the Antichrist gives him the ability to speak. So it's close there, but it's not really given the beast the ability to speak. It's giving the image of him the ability to speak. So again, I believe it's a statue that basically comes to life in some form and deceives people. Now, here's the real answer to this, though. There's nothing that says that's not AI. So, if you really want to believe that that statue is some type of robotic artificial intelligence, I can't find a single verse to say that's not what the statue is. We know the beast isn't an AI robot, but the statue very well could be. My only argument against it is, while I can't say it's not AI, if Satan has enough power to do everything else we see the beast and false prophet doing, I don't really think he needs AI. So it seems unlikely to me. But if that's what you see there, then I can't give you a verse that says that's not what it is. Sure. I have no idea. He says he gives it breath and the ability. The second beast was given the power to give breath to the image of the first beast. So to the people, it's going to appear, and to John, it appears that they made this statue come alive. How they do that? Is it AI? Is it Satan possessing it? Is it Satan replacing it with some demonic beast? There's a lot of answers there. So I'm going to leave that one as a maybe. Can't say it's not AI, but I have a hard time seeing it. So, all right. Now we get into a different line of questioning. Who attends the marriage supper of the Lamb? So it's a two-part question. Who attends the marriage supper of the Lamb, and is it the raptured only? So we talked about the marriage supper of the Lamb. So what I want to do right quick, we spent a lot of time going through all these details in Revelation, and I pointed out that things aren't in chronological order. So I realized when I went to answer this that because of the spaghetti way that we studied through it all, that we may not even be clear what the actual order of events is. Where is this even occurring at? So knowing where it occurs at will help with part of the answer. So I probably should have printed this out to be easier for you, but I'm going to go through a list of chronological order what's going on in Revelation, primarily to point out where the marriage supper of the Lamb is. So we have the seventh trumpet sound. So we're kind of jumping into the middle, but the point where the seventh trumpet sounds. Then we have the point that I talked about for a little bit where no one else could enter the temple. So after the seventh trumpet sounds, God the Father says he closes the temple. That's it. I don't want to hear anybody else's prayers. It's over. Who's saved is saved, and you're not, you're not. Then the third thing that happens is three events start to happen simultaneously. The 7 bowls of God's wrath are poured out. And while those 7 bowls of God's wrath are being poured out, we see the great prostitute destroyed and Babylon the Great destroyed, followed by great rejoicing in heaven. Then, when that's completed, we see the marriage supper of the Lamb. Then after that, we see the second coming of Jesus. This is where Jesus returns riding a white horse with the armies of heaven behind him. Then the battle of Armageddon, which is immediately what the reason Jesus returns, to wipe out Satan and his armies. Then we see the beast and the false prophet thrown into hell alive. Then we see Satan bound and thrown into the abyss. Then we see the millennium reign of Christ with the New Jerusalem. Then we see Satan released and people like the sand of the sea following him at the end of the millennium. Then God kills them all and throws Satan in hell for eternity. Then we see the great white throne judgment where the sinners are judged. And then the new heaven and the new earth. So kind of wanted to do that to show us kind of where in that process the marriage supper of the Lamb is at. So Revelation chapter 19, starting at verse 7, says, "Let us rejoice and be glad and give him glory, for the wedding of the Lamb has come, and his bride has made herself ready. Fine linen, bright and clean, was given her to wear. Fine linen stands for the righteous acts of God's holy people. Then the angel said to me, write this, blessed are those who are invited to the wedding supper of the Lamb. And he added, these are the true words of God." Those 3 verses in chapter 19, 7, 8, and 9, that is all Revelation tells us about the marriage supper of the Lamb. So, don't have a whole lot to go on there, but we can piece together a few other verses to give us a little more insight. So as far as who's there, we're going to get, the real question was who attends the marriage supper of the Lamb. We know God will be there. I assume he's the only authority qualified to marry them. So let's assume God's there. We know the groom will be there. That's Jesus. We know the bride will be there. We're going to get to that in a minute. Who is the bride? Because that's half of the real question. We know there are guests that are invited, because when we read that, it says, blessed are those that are invited. So we'll get to who are the guests. And we can assume the rest of heaven would also attend. I would assume angels and so on would also be there. So if you want more insight into the marriage supper of the Lamb, there are 2 parables in Matthew that you need to read. I'm not going to read all the way through them, but in Matthew chapter 22, verses 1 through 14 is the parable of the wedding banquet. And if you're familiar with that, where there's a marriage banquet and the guests that were invited don't come, and the king sends out people and says, compel people to come. Read that story, and then read those verses about the marriage supper of the Lamb in Revelation, and you'll see pretty quickly we're talking about the same event. Also, if you go to Matthew chapter 25 and read 1 through 13, the parable of the 10 virgins, where they had their oil and they were waiting for the bride to come, and some of them ran out of oil. Again, clearly talking about the whole marriage of the church to God. So there's some insight in those verses, in those 2 stories around it as well. Now, this is where it gets fun. Is first off, who is the bride of Christ? That's not as clear as you might think. So I listed a few verses if anybody's interested. Hosea chapter 2, verse 19, Isaiah 54:5, Jeremiah 2:2. All of these verses make it clear that Israel is the bride of Christ. So, we also know from quite a few New Testament verses that I didn't list that the church is called the bride of Christ. So, I would believe there that the Old and New Testament saints are the bride of Christ. And I believe that is the most correct answer, that both the Old Testament and New Testament saints are considered one to be the bride of Christ. That would include those that died before Jesus, that were looking forward to him, those that went up in the rapture, and Christians. And of course, the rapture would have been Christians that were alive at the rapture or Christians dead before the rapture. Now, here's where it gets a little murky. I can't find anything that tells us about the 144,000 Jews that were marked during the tribulation. Are they part of the bride of Christ? Or are they the guests? So that's an interesting one to consider. They may not be part of the bride of Christ because they weren't marked for being Christians. If they were Christians, they would have went up in the rapture. So God marked these 144,000 Jews that were clearly not Christians and told Satan you can't mess with them, and then at one point in Revelation takes them to heaven. So are they part of the bride of Christ? Maybe. Are they part of the group that's invited? Maybe. We know they're in heaven, but that's all we know. So who else might the guests include? We're not told. We're told that there's guests and that it's blessed to be a guest, but we're not told who the guests are. Some people will just say that's just the angels and nothing more. Other people will come up with other theories on that. So the martyrs that died during the tribulation for refusing to take the mark and serving God are not part of the raptured church. And God treats them differently during the millennium. So during the millennium, we know that God comes down with those people. We're told that the people that come down with him are the martyred saints. So that one also gets confusing. I don't know if those people are part of the bride or not. So the bride of Christ is probably the Old Testament saints, is definitely the church. There's no question it's the church, us. We're going to be the bride of Christ. The 144,000 Jews, not sure. The ones martyred during the tribulation, not sure. Now, just for fun, I'll throw this out. I ran across, researching this, quite a few people who make the argument that the bride of Christ is only the church, and that the Jews are not the bride of Christ, and that they're never actually called the bride of Christ. They're called the bride. So one argument that's out there is that the Jews are God's bride, and the church is Jesus' bride. I personally had a hard time following the argument on that one, and I read all the verses I could find of the people who subscribed to that theory and couldn't quite agree with it, but couldn't really find a good argument to disagree with it. So think on that one. Don't know. So I did want to point something out, though. We talked about earlier that the book of Joel is really fun. If you enjoyed Revelation, read Joel. I'll give you an even more fun one to read. So since we're talking about the bride of Christ, read Ezekiel, and especially Ezekiel chapter 16. If you have not read Ezekiel chapter 16, write it down and go home and read it. It's that important. It's going to blow your mind, I promise you. You will never look at sin the same way again after you read Ezekiel chapter 16. Imagine being excited about your upcoming wedding and then having to watch your fiancé cheat on you over and over and over again. This is what God has to put up with us. And in Ezekiel chapter 16, you'll see God express his extreme fury at this. And it'll make you, it'll make the lackadaisical attitude that people have about sin. It's no big deal. I'll just ask God to forgive me. It's just a white lie. It's no big deal. Read Ezekiel chapter 16. I promise you it's a big deal to God. So there's the answer to that question again. Don't know. Is the church the bride of the Lamb? Absolutely. Is the Old Testament saints? Probably. The Jews, the 144,000 Jews? Maybe. Maybe they're the guests. The ones killed in the millennium? Maybe. Maybe they're the guests. But we know that nobody after that, from the Battle of Armageddon, Jesus' second coming on, nobody in that's part of the bride of Christ because it's already happened. So during the millennium, what happens to some of those people? We'll talk about that in another question some more in a minute too, but don't really know what happens to them. So the next question, I wasn't 100% sure what I was being asked here. It says, is the New Jerusalem, the bride of Christ, saints, and I think it reads saints or Lamb's wife. I don't know if anybody that wrote that wants to clarify it or not, but I think that's what we're kind of, is the New Jerusalem, is it kind of, what is it? So in Revelation chapter 21, verse 2, it says, I saw the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God, prepared as a bride beautifully dressed for her husband. So that's not saying it is the bride, but he's saying he saw New Jerusalem coming down and it looks like a bride prepared for her husband. In Revelation 21, verses 9 and 10, it says, one of the seven angels who had the seven bowls full of the seven last plagues came and said to me, come, I will show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. So not in this case, it's not, I will show you something that looks like the bride or is dressed like a bride. He says, come, I'll show you the bride, the wife of the Lamb. And he carried me away in the Spirit to a mountain great and high, and showed me the holy city Jerusalem coming down out of heaven from God. Now, we talked about that order a minute ago of where events occur. The wedding, the marriage supper of the Lamb happens before Battle of Armageddon and before the second coming, before the millennium. So when the millennium happens and the New Jerusalem's coming down, the angel is saying, come and let me show you the bride. Not that it looks like it or is dressed like it. Now, the New Jerusalem, when we read the description of it, is clearly a large physical structure with a clear description. So we're told how wide it is, how tall it is, what kind of gates, about the streets, all kinds of things about it. So it's clearly a physical structure. But it's also clearly called the bride of Christ. So the assumption that I come to from that is that because that's coming down after the marriage supper of the Lamb and it's going to be on earth during the millennium, is that the people that are the bride of Christ are going to live in it. And if we were here for the description of it, it is not a small structure. 1,500 miles by 1,500 miles by 1,500 miles, that's a lot of real estate. So the assumption that I come to is that the reason the angel says it is the bride of Christ is that the Christians that were at the marriage supper of the Lamb are going to live in that New Jerusalem during the millennium. Now, I can't prove that, but that's my theory. I think it's kind of obvious, but maybe it's not obvious to everybody. So hopefully that answers that question. All right, now we get a really fun one. So this is where I get called out. So when we studied the second week, we talked about the 7 letters to the 7 churches. And I talked about different meanings of those, and I associated each one with a time period. So it got asked, where do you get the years for the various churches? Because obviously in the Revelation, he doesn't say this is the church from the year 300 to the year 500. So fun little question there. So when you're looking at Revelation chapters 2 and 3, they're traditionally interpreted in several ways. The first way, that's the most obvious, is they are literal letters to churches that existed in John's time. So we do know that each one of those letters was a church that existed in AD 90, and John was describing problems, or God was rebuking or admonishing those 7 churches for different things. That part there's probably no disagreement on. That's the obvious one. The next one that is probably easy to understand is that they are symbolic messages applicable to all the churches throughout the ages. So not every Christian and not every church in every age is cookie cutter. So just because God says that the church in the second age was persecuted and the third age wasn't, or the last age wasn't, doesn't mean there's not persecuted churches today. We're not persecuted. Nobody's locking us in jail and cutting our heads off for coming to church. But there are countries in the world where that is happening today. There are, so if you look at those 7 letters, you'll see that they can apply to churches or Christians throughout the times, regardless of when you live. There's always differences. The third one is where this question comes from. And I'm going to throw out a big word here. So that the ages of the church is not something I invented by any means. That has been around for a long time. If you want to research it, you need to write these big words down. It's in the framework of dispensationalist theology. So that's what it's called, dispensationalist theology. They are symbolic representations of 7 distinct eras of church ages in the history of the Christian church. And you say, well, where on earth did you get that from? So there's a couple ways we come up with that idea. One clue that there's more to this than just 7 letters to 7 churches is that each church there in chapters 2 and 3 corresponds so obviously to the parables in Matthew 13. So when you read Matthew chapter 13, you see God talking to the group, the public, about some parables, and then privately to his disciples about some parables. And each parable corresponds, and if we went over that when we talked about this, each parable corresponds one-to-one directly with these churches. And at the end of Matthew chapter 13, Jesus makes it clear to the disciples that this is prophetic, that these parables are talking about future events. So that's one clue. And then the second part of it is just taking those letters to the churches and looking at what are they being called out for and what are they being patted on the back for, and then just applying our knowledge of history, looking at the last 2,000 years and going, wow, Church 1 pretty well describes the first 300 years, and Church 2 really describes the next so many hundred years, and Church 3 describes the next 150 years. And so is there a biblical science to establishing what year corresponds to what church? No, not at all. Some of them have very clear frameworks. So, for example, the church that was persecuted so badly versus the church where they were accepted as the official religion of Rome. We know Emperor Constantine did that in a certain year. There's lots of history books will tell you what year that happened. So that year is kind of fixed. We know exactly when the church went from being persecuted to being the official religion of Rome. Now, do we know the exact year that the church went from, in the Middle Ages, went from one dispensation to the other? No, there's probably some of them, there's probably a 100-year range you could argue anywhere in it. So that is where those dates come from. Can I just absolutely find you a Bible verse that says right there, that proves that these correspond to the churches of certain ages? No. But it seems pretty obvious that it does. So, That's the answer to that one. All right. Could the red horse be China? So we're talking about in Revelation, so that was the question. In Revelation chapter 6, verses 3 and 4, it says, when the Lamb opened the second seal, I heard the second living creature say, come. Then another horse came out, a fiery red one. Its rider was given power to take peace from the earth and to make people kill each other. To him was given a large sword. So, I'm going to jump to Daniel chapter 11, verse 44. It says, but reports from the east and the north will alarm him being the Antichrist here. And he will set out in a great rage to destroy and annihilate many. Now, this verse is describing what happens during the seals. So when we talked about the seals, we know the first seal was the white horse that was an imitator of Christ. That's the Antichrist. The second seal's the red horse. And then we get into several seals about how much of the earth is destroyed and how much death and carnage happens. So we know there's a great war. And we pieced together some other verses that, those seals clearly, to me, clearly describe this is when I think God is just saying, I'm going to just take my hand off and let y'all destroy each other. I don't think these are demonic or angelic beings that are doing anything. I think this is us doing it ourselves. So the question then is this red horse Russia or China or somebody else? In Daniel, we know that he says from the east and the north. North of the Antichrist in Syria would be Russia, and east of him would be China. So there's your two of your obvious candidates. Now, there's plenty of other countries, but none of them would probably be big enough to challenge the Antichrist if he controls most of Europe. So, Ezekiel chapter 38, verse 14 says, therefore, Son of man, prophesy and say to Gog, this is what the sovereign Lord says. In that day when my people Israel are living in safety, will you not take notice of it? You will come from your place in the far north, you and many nations with you, all of them riding on horses, a great horde, a mighty army. So it is my belief that Ezekiel chapter 38 here is describing the war at the beginning of the tribulation, and that is where I based my belief that it's Russia. So again, it's a lot of this is like squinting through fuzzy glasses at puzzle pieces and trying to put them together. There's not an exact science on it. Can I prove it's not China? No. But I believe that this describes Russia in that first attack and corresponds to Revelation chapter 6, if you were there. I also believe that China is the army that's talked about during the sixth trumpet in chapter 9. When we talked about the 4 angels that were bound at the Euphrates and they're released and they get an army of 200 million, I think my belief is that's the Chinese army. And if they were the first army that the Antichrist destroyed, they wouldn't be there for this one. So, again, putting puzzle pieces together. But this is just my best guess to piece together the puzzle pieces. So, could the red horse be China? I don't think so, but it could be. So there's your super definitive answer to that one as well. So, all right. Who are the people who lived during the 1,000 years? Wasn't everyone dead? So the Christians are still in heaven. All right, so when we get to the millennial reign of Christ, we know there's a bunch of people on earth, and a pretty good question is, who on earth are they? So we know that all current Christians today are raptured at the start of the tribulation. So hopefully it won't be us. We know that a significant amount of Earth's population is killed by the various wars, attacks by demons, wrath of God. I mean, we read through Revelation. I mean, every time something happens, another fourth of the earth is destroyed. So we know that the population of Earth at the end of the tribulation is going to be a lot less than today. We know that everyone who takes the mark of the beast is destroyed. God made it very clear he'll kill everybody that takes the mark of the beast. So it's not them. We know that most, if not all, of the people that serve God during the tribulation are killed for it. While there's no verse that proves that if you're a Christian during the tribulation, you're going to be martyred for it. There's a lot of verses that make it pretty clear that most, if not all, are going to die for that. So I don't think it's people that get saved during the tribulation, because there's going to be very few, if any, of them that survive the tribulation. We know that everyone that chooses to fight with Satan at the Battle of Armageddon is destroyed. So God kills all them. So what does that leave? Not a whole lot, probably. But Revelation chapter 20, verse 3. This is at the end of the Battle of Armageddon. Says, he threw him into the abyss and locked and sealed it over him, to keep him from deceiving the nations anymore until the 1,000 years were ended. So, read between the lines there. That tells us there's still nations left, and there's still people he could deceive. If there's still people that Satan can deceive, that means they're not already people that have been completely saved. So it's not raptured people, because he can't deceive them anymore. It's not martyred people, he can't deceive them anymore. And it wasn't the people, the really evil people that took the mark of the beast. They've been destroyed. So there are nations and people left on earth at the end of the tribulation that Satan could have deceived had God not locked him up. Oh my goodness, my pronunciation went away from me. How do you say that book? Micah? I think that's right. Excuse me. Micah chapter 4, verse 1. In the last days, the mountain of the Lord's temple will be established as the highest of the mountains. It will be exalted above the hills, and peoples will stream to it. Many nations will come and say, come, let us go to the mountain of the Lord, to the temple of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways, so that we may walk in his paths. The law will go out from Zion, the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. He will judge many people and will settle disputes for strong nations far and wide. So there's a whole lot caught up in that one verse, where God's telling us that there's going to be nations that aren't Christians that come to the New Jerusalem to learn his ways, and there's going to be nations that he just settles disputes between. So despite the fact that we see absolute carnage during the tribulation, there's apparently a lot of people left. You know, is that a billion? Is it 100 million? I don't know, but there's apparently a lot of people left. So we know from reading that you know, there are people here. We also know that at the end of the 1,000 years, when Satan's released from the abyss, that people like the sand of the sea will follow him. So by the end of the millennium, there's going to be a whole lot of people, because however many choose to follow Satan was called out being like the sand of the sea, and I don't think everybody's going to follow him. So obviously there's a large number of non-Christians during the millennium. How many exactly start out and how many are born during the millennium, don't know. 1,000 years of people not being sick and dying could probably create a pretty massive population. So by the end of the tribulation, who knows? With the curse gone and the things we talked about last week with everything that's going to happen during the millennium, you know, could there be 100 billion people on Earth by the end of the millennium? Maybe, I don't know. So there's only two. So the question, and it's been a long time on this one, who are the people alive during the 1,000 years? Wasn't everyone dead? So first off, everyone's not dead. So are Christians still in heaven? That part, I don't think so. I think the Christians are in the New Jerusalem on earth with God. The question then is, who are those people? And I think there's really two groups of people. There are people that basically didn't take sides during the tribulation. So again, this is where we talked about when we talked about the beast. The beast never, Antichrist and beast, they never rule the whole world. They're going to rule a section of the world. We really don't know what happens to a lot of the world. You can't find much in Revelation that says where America is, where's Australia, where's South America. Maybe we're all destroyed. Maybe we just, like I said, decided to mind our own business for once. Maybe who knows? There may be a lot of people in those countries that just stayed out of it. We didn't follow God, but we didn't do anything with the Antichrist either. We just stayed here. Maybe that's who all these people are. There's another possibility I'll throw out. I'm not saying I endorse this one, but this just gives you something to chew on when you can't sleep at night. There are some verses in the Bible that says that God will not judge people for laws they were not aware of. So, it is an interesting possibility to think about that maybe during the millennium, God brings back people that he feels like did not have an adequate opportunity to, they didn't reject him. We know that people that reject God are going to hell, but what do when you have somebody who lived on an island in the Philippines and wasn't a bad person, but nobody ever told them about God, I'm going to say that's a highly debatable subject for another night, but it's possible that maybe they account for some of those people in the millennium. Maybe God says, I'm going to bring you back, and this time you will know the truth, and you can make a decision. Just some Jeremy's crazy theory to throw in there. All right. What is the difference between the abyss and hell? So I blew over that one real fast in one of the nights and obviously intrigued somebody. So in Revelation chapter 20, verse 13, says, the sea gave up the dead that were in it, and death and Hades gave up the dead that were in them. Each person was judged according to what they had done. Then death and Hades were thrown into the lake of fire. So we see three different terms here: death, Hades, and the lake of fire. My belief here is that death is talking about the physical bodies. The death is our physical bodies. Hades, this is where we also saw at the end of the at the beginning of the millennium, God had an angel throw Satan into the abyss. At the end of the 1,000 years after his final revolt, he throws him into the lake of fire. Now the term hell is not really found much in the Bible. That's not really a term you're going to see a lot, but you see the lake of fire. So lake of fire is hell, and we see Hades also used interchangeably with the abyss. So Hades is not hell. Hades and or the abyss seems to be a holding cell for sinners that are awaiting judgment. And the lake of fire is a permanent place that God made to throw Satan and his angels and then later sinners, that is permanent. It's my belief that today there is no one in hell in the lake of fire. It's empty right now because no sinners have been judged at the great white throne judgment, and God has not thrown the Satan and his angels into it. Yeah. In the what? I don't know. I've heard that term. I think so. Is it? Okay. So it also depends some on what version you're reading, whether they use one term or the other. It seems clear that there are two different places. Also, if you go to Matthew chapter 16, verse 19, and read the story about the rich man and Lazarus, you see an interesting scenario where the rich man has died and went to Hades, and he's talking to Lazarus, and it talks about the great chasm that's between them, that separates them. And what we seem to get a picture of is that there was a holding place for sinners and a holding place for Christians. Because we know that there's only one way to heaven, and that's belief in Jesus. So when Moses died, he's never met Jesus. Jesus hadn't lived yet. So how would Moses go to heaven? Well, he didn't. So Moses went to this holding place. This would have been where this story of the rich man and Lazarus took place. After Jesus died, we're told that he descended. So when Jesus died, we're told he descended. He didn't go down to talk to the rich man. They're going to be judged at the great white throne judgment. Jesus went down to the holding place for the Old Testament saints that had died looking forward to Jesus, and those people had to, we're not given much details on it, but somehow they had to express a belief in Jesus and then go to heaven. There's also a verse somewhere, I didn't find it for this, where it talks about after Jesus died, the hell enlarged itself, and it was talking about Hades. And the theory I've heard there is that once those Old Testament saints that followed Jesus went up, that all of it was turned into a holding place for sinners at that point. But getting on sketchy theology there. But so that's, hopefully that answers that some. So yeah, we tend to just use the word hell and assume it means everything all the time. But yeah, pay attention when you're reading all these verses to whether they say hell or Hades or different things, and it's interesting. I'm going to have to research the one you brought up because I didn't do any research into that one. So, and that's exactly why I didn't try to answer all these questions on the spot, because my answer to every question would probably be So some of these were a lot of fun to look up. Some of them I actually did not know what the answer was, and I had to just go after it and try and find it. Some of them I had a pretty good idea what the answer was, but I didn't know how to prove that. So then I had to spend some time trying to figure out how to prove it and hope I didn't disprove myself doing that. But so, all right, we got a couple more to get through here. Does new heaven and new earth mean a whole new planet? So Revelation 21 verse 1 says, "Then I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and first earth had passed away, and there was no longer any sea." So interesting verse. What we talked about that last week. What does the no sea mean? Interesting. Whether the earth is burned up, and I'll put burned up in quotes, whether it's burned up to purify it and then rebuilt, or whether it's completely destroyed, is not entirely clear. And I didn't, on this one, I didn't want to put a ton of verses because I just found more and more and more and more. As you go through the Old Testament, you will find no shortage of verses that seem to imply both ways. Every time I find a verse that seems to imply, that talks about how the very elements will be destroyed, then the next verse says that Jerusalem will be there forever. And then the next verse talks about how God's going to destroy the earth and rebuild it. And then you find the next chapter and it talks about how that the land of Israel will be the Israelites forever, not until God destroys it and rebuilds it. So I didn't put all these verses on there. You can go use an online Bible search out and find them. You'll probably be as confused as me. My final answer is I don't know on that one. I got no thought. Yeah. Clearly, after everything that happens in the book of Revelation, the earth's going to be a pretty big disaster. So, yeah, how far God goes in destroying it down to the core and rebuilding it, or just wiping it off the map and replacing it, I found lots of verses that seem to support both, and no one seemed to be better than another. So, couldn't really come to much conclusion there. It kind of depends on what you read. You'll read one and go, "Yep, that's pretty clear." Maybe not. So, don't know there. All right. Where are the Christians who already died? They go up in the rapture first. Where were they before? So this is a really fun question. So I am going to we're gonna look at a couple verses that again seem to contradict each other. 2 Corinthians chapter 5 verse 8 says, "We are confident, I say, and would prefer to be away from the body and at home with the Lord." So the writer of 2 Corinthians seemed like he believed that when he was away from his body, he would be with the Lord. Philippians chapter 1, verse 23 says, "I am torn between the two. I desire to depart and be with Christ, which is better by far, but it is more necessary for you that I remain in the body." So again, a belief here that we leave our body, we're going to go be with God. These two verses seem to both imply that we're with God after we die. Now, the verse that causes this question is 1 Thessalonians chapter 4, verse 16. It says, "For the Lord himself will come down from heaven, and with a loud command, and the voice of the archangel, and with the trumpet call of God. And the dead in Christ will rise first. After that, we who are still alive and left will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air. And so we will be with the Lord forever." Now, if you just read that one in 1 Thessalonians, it seems like that when we die, that, for lack of a better word, we're just kind of paused. We're nowhere. And when the rapture comes, God's going to call us up, and then we'll go be with God. So that verse seems to imply that we're not going to heaven until the rapture. The best verse that I could find is Luke chapter 23, verse 43. This is when Jesus was on the cross with the two sinners beside him. Jesus answered him, "Truly I tell you, today you will be with me in paradise." Now, that verse is pretty clear. That one doesn't leave a whole lot of room for interpretation. Jesus made it pretty clear to the thief on the cross beside him that not tomorrow, not sometime in the future, today you'll be with me in paradise. So that one's pretty clear. Because of that, I have to say I believe that we will be with Jesus immediately after we die, and that I do not understand what "and the dead in Christ will rise first" means, because I can't reconcile those two. The verse with Jesus in the center is pretty clear. We're going to be with him. Now, in Google searching of this and reading different theories on it and different churches' positions, one of the things I like to do is go out and find not only scholarly articles, but find different churches, whether I agree with them or not, and find out what their official position is. Sometimes just knowing, even if you don't agree with it, knowing why they think that will help you find arguments against it. I don't know if I believe this one or not, but I found multiple theologians that have proposed that our soul and consciousness goes to heaven immediately when we die, and that our physical body will come to heaven during the rapture. So that's the best explanation to me of why one verse says one thing and another verse says another thing. I don't know if that's a good theological position or somebody grasping at straws to explain two verses that don't seem to jive. So I'll let you pick that one. But their thought was that maybe we don't need a physical body in heaven, but we will during the millennium. So God needs to get their body because we're going to have our same body during the millennium, but maybe in heaven we don't need our body. So there you go. So yep. Yep. So that may fit with the view I found online of the spirit goes up, the body doesn't right then. So I'll be brave here. And does somebody have a question that we did not answer that they want to see if on an off chance I can answer off the cuff? When does what? Go ahead. So the story of of Lazarus and the rich man says that they're suffering there. That it's not a fun place to be. And remember, those are the people that are going to go to the Great White Throne Judgment, and we talked about that last week. The Great White Throne Judgment is not to decide if they're going to heaven or hell. That's already been decided. So it's not like they're in this place and they haven't had their trial yet. They haven't had their sentencing yet, but they're already convicted. When you die, your life has convicted you or not immediately. The Great White Throne Judgment is where God looks at opens the books and looks at what they did and decides what judgment to pass on them. So. Mm-hmm.
So that's why it's so enlarged, because paradise, today you will be with me in paradise. Paradise is where the ones who waited for the Messiah, that's my understanding.
Mm-hmm.
Shoot it down, but paradise is where the ones who were waiting for the Messiah, like Moses and David and all those. And Sheol, or Hades, was where those who were not believers were being held. So Jesus went down to, like we talked in Ephesians about, when he took captivity, which was paradise. Paradise, even though it was a pleasant place, was captivity. And he took them to heaven with him. And then that's why hell became bigger, or Hades became bigger. There was no more paradise. Because now, today you will be with me in paradise. He was still alive when he said that to his disciples. And he went to paradise, and he took all the believers, those who were waiting for to heaven. And now, when we die, we go to our spirit goes to heaven. Our body stays here, and when he comes back, our bodies will rise, and the believers will rise, and their bodies and their spirits will be dormant, and then the other folks will go to the
Yep. Yeah, one of the biggest challenges with this entire study and even with these questions is not turning every question into an hour and a half discussion, because you start researching them, and with the tools that are out there, which just for daily reading, having a Bible's great. I love my printed giant print size Bible. If I'm just going to go read some chapters or read a book, I like a paper book. But when you're researching stuff, there is nothing like having a digital version of the Bible where you can search for words and phrases and then being able to go Google it, and also using AI tools. AI tools, by the way, can be really cool if you're not. I'll put a quick plug in if you're not familiar with tools like ChatGPT and stuff like that. Phenomenal. Are they going to give you correct Bible doctrine? No, don't look to them for Bible doctrine. But there are things like, for example, if I want to find everywhere in the Bible that talks about horses, well, I can go to my Olive Tree Bible app and search for horse. I'll find an awful lot of places in the Bible that talk about horses, and sometimes it can be overwhelming. And then not only can it present an overwhelming amount of information, it can then miss places because maybe it wasn't called a horse. Maybe I didn't realize the verse I'm looking for was a donkey, not a horse. And things like that. And that's where AI tools can be handy, because you can go to ChatGPT and say, where are all the references in the Bible where a prophet is riding a horse? You can't do that in a search engine. ChatGPT will tell you, list them out. Here, every verse where a prophet was talked about being riding a horse. And even include things like, well, this verse doesn't say a horse, but it implies it's a horse. So there's a lot of neat things you can do with that. Now, keep in mind those are just tools. I'm not going to get my theology from a AI engine, but they're cool tools to help you find stuff. And what happens is when you start researching these things, and you combine your reading your Bible with searching the Bible app, with Googling it, with AI tools, you can get a massive amount of information, and we could easily turn any question we had tonight into an hour and a half study. So if there's something that's really puzzling you and you really want to dig into it, combine all those tools and you'll be blown away at what you can find. So. I think that it's hard not to look at the end times. I mean, so much of the end time, so much of the Old Testament prophecies revolve around Israel. So Revelation revolves around Israel. We know that Israel is the centerpiece of all of this. It's hard not to look at Israel and what's going on over there and think that it doesn't. But I would just caution to say that I'll bet you that Jews that were in World War II in Europe that were being killed in concentration camps probably thought it could never get worse, and probably were pretty convinced that was the end. So while yes, it fits into it, I mean, is everything that happens in Revelation is going to absolutely revolve around Israel. We're told over and over of all the different battles and how God's going to destroy the people that attacked them and destroy their enemies. And the Battle of Armageddon is in the Valley of Jehoshaphat there in the Middle East. I mean, we know everything centers around Israel. Is the current stuff that's happening fixing to be the trigger to that? Could be. I mean, if you watch news much, you know that we're one dumb decision away from half the world being in a war over Israel right now, because everybody over there is mad about it, and all it would take is Iran launching an attack again, and the U.S. deciding to defend them or not defend them, and suddenly we're in a war. Israel, we all know, has nukes. If Iran attacks them and America says, we're done with this, we're not defending you anymore, when Israel feels like they're going to lose, they'll nuke every country attacking them. I'm pretty sure at that point we'll be in Revelation, I think. But, is it entirely possible that all the craziness going over there will calm down and 30 years from now we'll still be having this conversation? Sure. But we know that all these prophecies revolve around Israel. So when I see crazy stuff going on in Israel, it does make me stop and think, are we about there? Maybe so.
We found a scripture the other night when we were studying. I don't remember which one, but it talked about how the strongholds in Gaza, it was specifically Gaza.
Yeah, one of the Old Testament prophecies calls out Gaza and a war where Israel destroys their walls. So it's interesting. There's lots of fun stuff around that. So, and that's another one of my study tactics I did not mention is I come up with stuff and then I print out a copy of my notes and I give it to my wife and tell her to read it and critique it. And sometimes she tells me she doesn't like it, it doesn't make sense, etc. So then I have to go back and rethink, do I really want to do this if she says it doesn't make sense? Oh, is this the one? Yeah, Isaiah 25:11. God will bring down their pride despite the cleverness of their hands. He will bring down your high fortified walls and lay them low. He will bring them to the ground, to the very dust. And somewhere in there he calls out Gaza. Not that verse particularly, but
On that question of me having a new earth and is it going to be a totally new planet, one of the things that I thought about when y'all were talking about that is over and over in the Bible, things happen over and over again. Like, for example, God created the earth, and then you think maybe between Genesis 3 or 1 and 3, he destroyed it and he recreated it. Remember that? And that's because when that was
it's possible that we could be this close to all this happening, and then God says, you know what? There's still more people I want to be saved, and he puts an end to it, says, I'm going to wait a while. Don't know. It's also very interesting, not that it has to do with our study, sort of, Revelation, but, we tend to get very wrapped up in thinking that the whole world revolves around our short lifespan, and we're told over and over in the Bible that our life is but like a whisper to God. Not only is all of human history is a whisper to God, the earth and the universe has been around for much, much longer than we have. And we know in Revelation that we'll rule and reign with God forever. Forever is a long time. So there's a lot that could have happened before us and a lot that's going to happen after us. And I think someday, eventually, we'll all be doing whatever we're doing. And we're going to realize that not only was our life a short whisper, but all of humanity was a short whisper. What was God doing He's been here forever. What was he doing before we were here? I don't know.
It kind of made me think when you said new heavens and new earth, like all this space exploration and new planets being started and all of that. That's where my mind went to. Right.
The scripture does say that heaven and earth will pass away,
Yeah.
but my word will never.
Yeah.
There is going to be a new
So. So, in about 10,000 years, let's all meet back up, and we can discuss all this and see who was right. Says, eternity's a long time. Who knows what we'll be doing, but I suspect that it will be fun. So.
Well, and then that verse says, as high as the heavens are above the earth, so high are his ways above our ways, and his ways are past finding out. The biggest thing we can think of is the Jesus Christ.
Yep.
And
I have one closing thought for this whole series. Knowledge of the Bible is wonderful. It's fun to learn. I think we should learn it. I don't think God put it there for us to not learn. But God also called out one of the churches in the letters to the churches for their doctrine, but they didn't have love. Knowing all this stuff doesn't make any difference if we don't have compassion and love. And the Bible makes it real clear that if you had to pick one or the other, the love's more important. So while it's lots of fun to argue Bible, and I love to do it more than just about anybody, what we're going to do after the millennium is completely irrelevant to getting to heaven. So we can all disagree on it, but it doesn't matter, and none of us can prove our theories anyway. So, this stuff is a lot of fun to learn, and there's a lot of good biblical truth in it that we learned, but at the end of the day, none of it does any good if we don't have compassion and love, and we're not trying to get other people to go to heaven with us. That's the end. So I'm going to pray and we'll be dismissed. God, thank you again for letting us study your word. God, help us to learn what you want us to learn. But God, more importantly, give us a burning compassion and love for sinners, that when we see sinners, we'll see them the way you see them, and that we'll want them to join us in heaven. God, thank you. In Jesus' name, amen.